Hey there! The Danish Gambit is a very exciting opening, so today we're going to learn some traps for white and black, and while studying the traps we're also going to learn some of the most important ideas in this Gambit. So after e4 and e5, white goes for d4, and after black takes, here white could take on d4 with the queen, but c3 leads the game into the Danish Gambit. So taking the pawn looks very natural. We're also going to evaluate some interesting continuations for black later, but after pawn takes, knight takes is the most common way. We're also going to study an alternative later, and here white gave a pawn, but in return white gets very quick development, and white's pieces are already fairly active, whereas black's pieces are on the 8th rank and not so easy to develop. Taking that into account, the move bishop to b4 is very common here. Black develops the bishop, pins the knight. Black would love to castle after moving the knight on g8, and here one move that I really like is the move queen to d4. In fact, it is also the best performing move. The queen is very often misplaced on d4 because it can be easily attacked, but here we are eyeing the bishop and the pawn on g7. And here the best way for black to continue is to take on c3, and after queen takes, white gets very good compensation of the pawn, having these very strong bishops. But here black has tried the move knight to c6. Black attacks the queen, defends the bishop, and even though white can take up on g7, the idea is to follow up with the move queen to f6. So black is given the pawn back, and the main point is that after the queen trade, black is getting a lot of development in return, so this position looks fairly playable for black. But here comes a very shocking move. This is a very weird tactic. Here white goes bishop to h6, just defending the queen on g7, and even though it seems that black has pressure on c3, if black takes on c3, then the queen is guarding the pawn on c3, so black cannot take on c3. And the main idea for white is to trade queens and then go bishop to g7. For example, after a move like d6, white will simply trade queens, and then after bishop to g7, white is forking the knight and the rook and winning material. So bishop to h6 is a very pretty move that leaves white with an advantage. If black takes on g7, then after bishop takes, white is going to collect the rook on h8. And the relatively best here is to go queen takes h6, knight takes will leave the queen undefended, and after queen takes, white can pick up the rook, and black can try to fight on with the move king to f8. Although here white is doing perfectly fine, white has an extra exchange, white can continue with knight to f3, and then after a move like d6, we can attack the bishop. If bishop takes, the queen can take back, and after the bishop moves, the queen might be a bit misplaced here, but here white has an interesting plan. Let's remember that this is the best play for black. Here the move h4 is very good, planning to go knight to g5, so here white has a clear advantage. So let's move on to another trap. After d takes c3 and knight takes, bishop to b4, queen to d4 is quite interesting, but the move bishop to c4 is also very common and good. It also sets up some nice traps, so black already has to be quite careful. The best way for black to continue is to go bishop takes, and then play a move like d6 or knight to c6, planning to develop the knight on f6. Otherwise, the bishop on b4 might fall under attack, as we'll see. And here black might be tempted to go knight to f6, simply developing and preparing to castle. And here we're going to play the move e5, and black's idea is to go knight to e4, otherwise the knight doesn't have any other squares besides going to g8. Knight to e4 is possible because the knight on c3 is pinned, but here after the move queen to d5, black's position is already losing because we have a very nice fork. We plan to take on e4 or to take on f7, giving a checkmate. Black can give a check, but after we take, there's no good defense for black. Black could try knight to g5, defending, but here we can simply take, and after queen takes, we take on f7, and then we can simply go knight to f3. Black doesn't even have material in return, and black's king on d8 is very badly placed. So after bishop to c4, taking on c3 is important for black, because developing the knight to another square like e7 is not very good, because here we have another instructive tactic. Here we can take on f7. This is another typical idea in the Danish, to put pressure on f7, and after king takes and queen to b3, we're getting the piece back. Black would go d5, and after queen takes, the position is materially balanced, but this position looks a lot easier to play for white since the king on f7 is not very well placed. Now let's move on to another trap for white. Besides taking on c3 with the knight, there's another pawn sacrifice which is very common in the Danish Gambit, which is to go bishop to c4 straight away. And the point is that after black takes a second pawn, we take with the bishop. White's pieces are just extremely active, and black has to be very careful to hold the balance. Knight to f6 in this position has been tried. It is actually fairly interesting because if we go e5, which very often is quite strong, here black's idea is to counterattack with the move d5. But instead we can simply go knight to c3, defending the pawn e4, and here the move e5 is sooner or later going to be annoying. There's also ideas to go queen to b3, putting pressure on f7, if black goes d6. That's why black very often gives back some material with the move d5, planning to catch up with development. And now here we're gonna take on d5 with the knight, already setting up a trap. If black takes on e4, then after queen to e2, we're gonna pin the knight, and we're gonna win material. For example, after the move bishop to f5, f3, we'll pick up the knight. We could even castle long because here we have a lot of activity, and black's king on e8 is very badly placed. So after knight takes e5, black normally takes on d5, and after bishop takes, here the move bishop to b4 looks quite tempting. Black develops with tempo, giving a check, and here we can try the move king to f1, inviting black to fall for our trap. So here black should go c6. This should be the best way for black to continue. And here we can go for this similar tactic of bishop takes and queen to b3, picking up the bishop, although this position remains playable for black. But here the most tempting is to castle, protecting the pawn on g7, but here after the move queen to d4, the game is just over because we're going to either checkmate or pick up the bishop on b4. Now let's analyze some interesting ideas for black. So I'm now focusing on black side, that's why we're seeing the board from the other side. So here white goes for the Danish Gambit. We can definitely take on c3, but just want to mention that going d5 is fairly good to get a playable position as black, just counterattacking on the center straight away and not trying to get too greedy. For example, after white takes and queen takes, white normally takes on d4 with the pawn. If white takes with the queen, then we simply trade queens. We could even try to fight for an advantage, trying to attack this pawn on d4. And after white takes on d4, black can simply develop with knight to c6, and after a move like knight to f3, go bishop to g4, then we can quickly develop. We can even castle long in that line, so this is just a playable position for black. But we could also take on c3. We already analyzed knight to c3, and if white goes for this bishop to c4 idea, sacrificing another pawn, taking on b2 is possible, although we need to be a bit careful. But here the simplest for black to equalize the position is to go d5 straight away. If white takes with the e pawn, then we can simply go knight to f6 and bishop to d6. Black has a perfectly playable position. Black might even fight for an advantage with an extra pawn. So after d5, bishop takes is the best continuation. And here the move knight to f6 is quite interesting because it seems that black is falling for a trap, which white actually should go for this line, which is to take on f7. Otherwise black is ready to take on d5 and even try to fight for an advantage. And after bishop takes, it seems that white is going to pick up the queen, but we can simply take on f7. And after queen takes, black has this counterattack with bishop to b4, giving a check and attacking the queen on the 8. And here white should be careful and go queen to d2, otherwise black is gonna get an extra piece. And after queen to d2, bishop takes and knight takes, black has a perfectly playable position. The king on f7 is safe without queens, and now the rook can easily develop, so this is a perfectly playable line for black. So the move d5 is a very good move by black, and after bishop takes, besides knight to f6, which pretty much forces a balanced position with correct play, here black could try the move bishop to b4 if black wants to go for a more complicated line with chances for both sides. The idea is to develop with check and then go knight to f6, although here black has to be a bit careful as we'll see because there's an idea of queen to a4 giving a check, attacking the bishop. For example, white can try the move king to f1. These positions are very complicated, we need to double check the tactics each time, but in this particular position the move king to f1 is not that strong because now black can go for this plan of knight to f6. Black is attacking the bishop, ready to castle, but this seems to blunder material because after the move queen to a4, we get a fork, but after knight to f6, bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes is actually quite bad for white, because here we have the counter-attack. Queen to d1, we give a check, queen to e1 blocks the check, but after the move bishop to a6, we're gonna force a checkmate after knight to e2, bishop takes, king to g1, and queen takes. So you now know a few interesting traps for white and black in the Danish Gambit. Feel free to try them in your games and let me know about it. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.